Can everybody hear okay? Okay, great. Thank you for that very nice introduction, Rob. And I will say that among the things, one of the great things about Rob leaving Montana and coming to Colorado to be at the Independence Institute full-time is, besides doing public education things like this, which is really the key reason he left academia, was to reach the larger audience of the American public. We still do legal cases. We did, Rob and I worked together on Rob supplying most of the intellectual firepower, a brief in the 11th Circuit on the Obamacare case, filed a similar brief in the case that's currently before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. It was about the original meaning of the necessary and proper clause, and it seemed like in the 11th Circuit, the majority, two-judge majority, did find some of our arguments persuasive. And when Obamacare goes to the Supreme Court, Rob and I will be back before the Supreme Court with an amicus brief on that issue. So you say, well, what went wrong? We had all this swell Constitution Rob described, and how did we get in the situation we're in today? In one respect, it wouldn't have surprised the founders, as Abigail Adams, our greatest founding mother, once wrote in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, "Power is like the grave, ever grasping, and always cries, give, give." And there is as the founders well knew, this is why they set up a government of enumerated limited powers with checks and balances, was you can't depend forever on the self-restraining virtue of people in government. There will be a natural tendency of people in government to sincerely think that greater governmental powers for themselves are a good thing. And indeed, we saw that in the administration of John Adams himself. When the Constitution was being drafted, and then as Rob, I think one of the important contributions of Rob in constitutional scholarship is when we look at original meaning. Of course, what was said at the Philadelphia Convention and before that is all very important. But the most important thing, because the document derives its authority from the people, is what was said during that ratification debate period. How did the proponents of the proposed Constitution, what did they promise the American people when there was a clause that, like all human language, has some necessary ambiguity in it? How was it explained? What did these particular clauses mean? And these were the campaign promises of the Constitution, and those are what is most binding of all in terms of original meaning. And when the Anti-Federalists said, well, what if the Congress tries to censor the press? It was explained quite accurately, what are you guys talking about? Look at Article 1, which gives Congress its powers. Do you see anything in there that could possibly be used to censor the press? Post offices, the militia, bankruptcies, patents, commerce among the several states and with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. You'd be crazy the Federalists argued, to say anything in there could possibly be stretched to allow Congress to censor the press. And further, is James Madison, to mollify skeptics of the Constitution, put in a Bill of Rights. Was the lead in Congress enacting and then sending to the states a Bill of Rights, which made it pretty clear that jurisdictionally, Congress had nothing to do with the press. Congress shall make no law. Pretty straightforward. And yet, only a few years later, the Congress passed and President John Adams signed the Sedition Act, which made it a federal crime to say false things about the president or the government of the United States, bringing it into disrepute. Now, compared to the parallel law in England at the time, it was a relatively liberal law in that if you could actually prove what you said about King George was true, that wouldn't necessarily do you any good in an English court, but it would be a defense in to the Sedition Act. But the point was, less than a decade before, we'd all agreed that Congress had no authority to enact any kinds of laws like that, and yet a decade later, it did. And at the very beginning, Rob talked about, well, what are the constitutional remedies? And very high on that list is the process we have, thank God, and no thanks to North Carolina Governor Beverly Perdue, of regular elections. And in 1800, the people delivered their verdict in the election between Jefferson and Adams that the Sedition Act, whatever arguments you could make in favor of it, the people decided that it was unconstitutional, and they changed administrations, and so the Sedition Act expired. But the problem we face today of this ever-grasping and increasingly powerful federal government got its most serious start in what's now called the Progressive Era, which begins in the late 19th century and then continues with ups and downs and political backs and forths until its complete triumph in the second FDR term, and then in the 1940s. Now, when I say progressives, the people I'm talking about, I'm not talking about modern folks who call themselves progressives. There are some parallels between the so-called progressives of 2011 and the progressives of 1911, but there are also a lot of important differences. But what I'm talking about is going to be the old-fashioned original progressives. One of the key progressive beliefs is they were very strongly anti-individualist, that they believed that the individual needed to be subordinated to the collective good. Individualism, self-reliance, rugged individualism, all those things were not compliments in the view of progressive. And they therefore were quite hostile to all claims of individual rights or to limits on government power. And that's one of the reasons they were quite indifferent to the oppression of blacks at the time, which actually got much worse in the progressive 1890s, 1910s than it had been in the 1870s or 1880s. They were, once you start with these premises I've just given you, quite hostile to judicial review of government action. They didn't like too many checks, or many at all, checks and balances, including the check of judicial review of constitutionality. And among some of them, not all, but some, there was really a contempt for the constitutional limitations on governmental powers. They thought the Constitution was outdated and it was insufficient for the needs of modern times. Woodrow Wilson, in his pre-presidential academic career, was very much had that point of view. And here's the point of view of President Franklin Roosevelt. In 1935, in a letter he wrote to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, "I hope your committee will not permit doubts as to the constitutionality, however reasonable, to block the suggested legislation." Holy cow. That guy took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the constitutionality of the United States, except when we want to do something else. In the progressive period, there were 4 amendments added to the Constitution. And that's, by the way, the proper way to do things. Is when you want to change things, add an amendment. They were successful at convincing the American people to add these amendments. The first of these, the progressive amendments, was the 16th Amendment, the income tax. Of course, it was promised it would only be a very small tax on high incomes. Its practical effect turned out to be huge because of the golden rule, which is whoever has the gold makes the rules. And the income tax, there was only so much money the federal government could raise through tariffs and other taxes which were provided for in the original Constitution. Once they got the ability to tax incomes, it drastically increased federal revenue when Congress decided it wanted to drastically increase federal revenue. And that power of the purse shifted so hugely towards the federal government that almost necessarily political power came with it. Next was the 17th Amendment, providing for the direct election of senators. Its purpose was to avoid there were problems of corruption. You would occasionally have state legislatures that deadlocked when there was a vacancy, it didn't fill in a senator. And so in fact, many states had already, through their own constitutional revisions, provided for a direct election of senators, but the 17th Amendment made it nationwide. Unlike some folks, the 17th Amendment completely failed to solve all the problems that it was intended to solve, like too much money in politics. But it was successful, I think, in many unintended ways by making the Senate closer to the people. For one thing, it means that when you vote for your state legislature, you can vote for the guy on how he's going to govern and vote on Colorado issues. And you don't have to think about, well, but he's going to also be casting the vote for a United States Senator. So if you think Ken Salazar would be a better senator than Pete Coors, you can vote for Ken Salazar directly and not have to vote for the Democrat for state representative in 2004 so that he'll vote for Ken Salazar in the Senate. It disaggregates, and that's a way that in a practical sense does bring government closer to the people. I would also say, as a Second Amendment advocate, the fact that senators are directly elected has made a huge difference in the survival of the Second Amendment, because it makes senators have to be very concerned about that 4 or 5% of the popular swing vote that will vote on Second Amendment issues when Second Amendment rights are particularly threatened. But so I'm all for keeping the 17th Amendment, but it's also fair to say that in practice, when senators are now responsive and directly chosen by the people, rather than chosen by the state legislatures, their interest in protecting the states' rights, the 10th Amendment, the limitations on federal powers vis-a-vis the states, got considerably less. And in fact, you see many of the state legislative election of senators was the most important by far of the checks and balances for federalism itself in the Constitution. You can set out all the principles you want, but how are they actually going to be enforced? Having the Senate tied to the states was probably 90% of the actual enforcement power in the original Constitution for the state-federal balance. And so when that went, problems were almost inevitable. The 18th Amendment is an interesting one. That's the one that empowered Congress to prohibit the sale of alcohol. And notice, alcohol was at the time recognized as a national social problem, that if you had a prohibition in one state but not in the others, in another, then there would be some problems of enforcement, because you could get alcohol from a state where it was legal, and even if it was illegal to cross state lines with the alcohol you say legally bought in New York and take it into New Jersey. You still, even you could make that a federal crime, that's still in practice, as long as alcohol could legally be manufactured in New York, you would have trouble. But they didn't try to say, oh, making alcohol, operating a brewery in New York City and selling beer by the glass to people in New York City, well, Congress can just do that because under the Interstate Commerce power. No, that's not interstate commerce, that's manufacturing, which is not commerce. Commerce is buying and selling, mercantile exchange. And it's to someone who's consuming it in New York. If you want to ship a keg of beer from New York City to Hoboken, New Jersey, there's some interstate commerce for you. But keep it in New York State, that's not interstate commerce. And so properly, the people said, we want to have a federal power over alcohol. We will amend the Constitution to create it. It turned out alcohol prohibition was a great fiasco, caused more problems than it was worth, and was repealed, again, by the people with the 21st Amendment. Most importantly of all, for the economic reasons, that during the Depression, they wanted people to be able to go back to work at breweries. And then there was the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote in federal in elections. Most states had already done that, but this made what was already a strong national majority unanimous. I think it's a good idea. It's important to the consent of the governed. But it's also true as a practical sense that it shifted the electorate leftward. If we hadn't had the 19th Amendment and no state had ever changed its own laws voluntarily, then the last presidential candidate who won a majority of the male vote, the last Democrat one, I believe was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So, it moved politics. Again, I think that's okay. A big part of the progressive theory was something that could be called corporatism. And under the corporatist theory, what you do is you get big government, big business, and big labor unions to agree on how to cartelize their particular industry. And when you run a cartel, you can do it so it's sort of, you divide up the spoils fairly. The government will get some more money in taxes. Businesses, because it's a cartel and it's less competitive, businesses can charge higher prices, which gives them higher profits. And some of that business higher profits can be spent on higher salaries for the unions. So it's a win-win-win for them. It's a bad deal for the consumers, for small business, and for the workers who were shut out of the cartels, which especially in the progressive era included the blacks. Blacks were excluded from most unions. The first modern government to be run on corporatist principles was Mussolini's fascist dictatorship in Italy. And in fact, before Mussolini's invasion of Europe in the mid-1930s, he was quite popular with many Americans and is seen was a great visionary and a model. So progressivism had gone up and down, had done quite well in the 1910s, aided by World War I, as it's been observed, war is the health of the state. There had been a movement back against that in the 1920s, especially with Herbert Hoover, with Moore Harding, back to normalcy, with Calvin Coolidge, one of only two actual conservative presidents of the 20th century. Then the progressives had started again on the upslide with the election of Herbert Hoover, a conservative, a Republican, but also a progressive. Unlike today, progressive was not a one-party kind of thing. And then the Great Depression happens. There's 25% unemployment, a terrible national crisis, and people very strongly feel that something has to be done. Franklin Roosevelt gets elected campaigning on a balanced budget, criticizing Hoover's tax increases and his stimulus program of the day, both of which turned out to be counterproductive. But Roosevelt then, once in office, quickly pivots, and among things that gets created in the first 100 days is the National Recovery Administration. This is known as the bad NRA. He puts in charge of it, and the bad NRA's job is to cartelize basically almost the entire American economy. He puts in charge of a General Hugh S. Johnson, who was not fascist-like in some of his views. He was actually a genuine fascist. He handed out copies of a fascist tract called The Corporate State, written by one of Mussolini's famous economists, and Frances Perkins, I believe the first female to serve in the cabinet, she was the labor secretary, warned Roosevelt that, hey, this guy's a real fascist. The Supreme Court eventually got a case called Schechter Culture, and unanimously ruled the NRA unconstitutional. That unanimous ruling, joining that, was Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, a great justice and also one of the great heroes of the progressive movement, and a guy who in general was much more tolerant of letting governments do economic regulation than with sometimes conservative majority on the court in the 20s and 30s. But even for Brandeis, this went too far, and actually in a private meeting in Supreme Court chambers, Brandeis told one of Roosevelt's assistants, the message from today's Schechter Culture decision is the court's had it, no more of this centralization stuff. Well, Roosevelt didn't agree with that. He could have proposed, and there were actually ideas out there to say, well, let's have a constitutional amendment. We wanted to do something about alcohol, we did it. Let's have a constitutional amendment to give the federal government much more power over the economy. Fine, if the people ratified it, that's how it goes, fair and square. But the reality is, even without a constitutional amendment, the Supreme Court cannot stand forever against enduring popular majority opinion. And so in 1937, the Supreme Court had enough justices who gave up or switched and let things go the way they did. And besides that, Supreme Court justices are not immortal, and Roosevelt eventually got to appoint all 9 justices of the Supreme Court. And like many presidents, when they appoint a Supreme Court justice, they may not be able to get everything to decide exactly the way they want, but they'll often say, there's one thing I really want, and it's going to be this, and I'm going to make sure I get it. Richard Nixon appointed to say, I want law and order, I want people who are going to cut back on the Warren Court, and certainly not expand the Warren Court protections of the criminal procedure provisions of the Bill of Rights. He got it. George Bush got appointees who were not going to question executive power in the war on terror, and Franklin Roosevelt got people who would absolutely stand aside against government control of the economy. And so much of the National Recovery Act ended up being reenacted piecemeal. The power to regulate commerce among the several states was reinterpreted as a power to regulate all economic activity under the theory that all, even local activity, could have a substantial effect on interstate commerce, which, as Rob pointed out, is true, and as the Pocahontas movie explains, we're all connected to each other. And they're all true, but that's not what the original Constitution had. The original Constitution had known that and declined to give Congress substantial effects power over the economy. There was the case of Wickard versus Filburn, which upheld the Agriculture Adjustment Act, which was a NRA for agriculture, cartelizing agriculture. And in Wickard versus Filburn, the court says even if you're producing wheat only on your own farm for consumption only on that farm, that still can be regulated under the interstate commerce powers. And that got them to the 20% of wheat that never entered the market. Upholding the separation of powers, previous courts had fitfully upheld something called the Non Delegation Doctrine, which is based on the first sentence of Article 1 of the Constitution. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Now, when you say all, you would think that ain't very ambiguous, but it seemed to be to some people. And so Congress could pass a general law, like the National Recovery Act, which got struck down partly on this problem. But Congress could pass laws on lots of things and say, well, we're not actually going to write those, what the laws are. We're going to enact some general principles to give guidance to a regulatory agency, and then the regulatory agency will create the real laws that apply in a practical sense. This has a couple practical effects. One is you can have way more laws, because 535 congressmen, even with all the aides you can imagine, and even if they worked 16-hour days, 365 days a year, still couldn't produce as many laws as we have produced basically annually by the federal regulatory agencies, creating regulations to carry out congressional statutes. And secondly, it creates a serious problem of what David Schoenbrod calls power without responsibility, how Congress abuses the people through delegation, because it allows Congress to enact a law that has a bunch of platitudes in it and doesn't make the necessary trade-offs. So the Environmental Agency shall protect the people from all dangerous air pollution, but shall do so without harming the economy, and shall do so with maximal efficiency. I exaggerate, but really only slightly on this. And so Congress gets to say, oh, we did this nice thing, look at this great law, and then when the EPA tries to carry out these sometimes conflicting mandates in the statute, what are they, they're the ones who get blamed. The congressman who voted for the original law gets to go back home to the district and fulminate against the bureaucrats of the EPA, when in fact it's the law he created which didn't make the tough choices that, for example, the EPA is making now. And what the EPA is doing on global warming, A, would kill the economy, B, is following the statute that Congress created about air pollutants. And once you say carbon dioxide is an air pollutant, the EPA, following the statute, doesn't really have any choice. And so now they're in this sort of dilemma of saying, well, we'd actually need about 21,000 more employees just to enforce on carbon dioxide the way we enforce on carbon monoxide, and nitrous oxide, and volatile organic compounds, and genuine pollutants. And we can't do that, and it would be impossible, so we're just going to dumb the statute down and apply it only part ways, which isn't really legal either. The decision should be made by Congress, and Congress, with public scrutiny, should be the one that has to make the decisions on these kinds of issues. Robin mentioned the spending power. The spending power which was to carry out the various purposes, like raising and supporting armies, establishing post offices, and so forth. The spending power was completely untethered from any of the enumerated powers, and likewise from the general welfare limitation on it. So rather than spending being for the general welfare, it could be, fairly frankly, for special interests. This also led to the allowing of conditional grants to the states, like, dear states, we will give you money if you do say as a matching grant, if you do the following. And this has the practical effect of turning the states into local administrative appendages of the federal government. They become hooked on it. Federal money is now a huge fraction of total state revenue, which necessarily reduces autonomy. And here's an important part. Almost every state has a balanced budget amendment, so they can only spend as much money as they can raise in taxation, and even with revenue gimmicks and things, creative criminal type accounting, if we're done by a corporation that's done by California, even with that, a balanced budget amendment still puts some kind of restraint on state spending, and so the states, there has to be some kind of rough balance between how much the state spends and how much taxation the people of the state will tolerate. But when you make federal spending, which doesn't have a balanced budget restriction in it, part of the state budgets, then you grow the size of the state governments much larger than ever would be tolerated by the people if they had to pay for it directly, because the money comes from the federal government, and the federal government, as we all know, gets its money by digging up those trillions of dollars that Ronald Reagan wisely buried in the backyard of the White House back in 1986. Further limiting the checks and balances, besides the direct end of the introduction of direct election of senators, is the judicially created rule that a taxpayer can't sue over the illegal expenditure of government money. Theory is, you got to have, Article 3 says, courts hear, federal courts hear cases and controversies. That means something in which you've got a particular interest in it rather than sort of your generalized grievances. And so therefore, an individual can't sue about an illegal expenditure of tax money in violation of the Constitution. That's Frothingham v. Mellon from 1923, by the way, not from the New Deal Court. And, to make it worse, neither can the states. Massachusetts v. Mellon, also from 1923. The 10th Amendment was discarded in practice by being described as a mere truism, in contrast to James Madison's view that it was really reflecting something quite important about the Constitution, mainly as he wrote in one of the Federalist Papers, that the powers of the federal government would be few and defined. And the court likewise gave up any idea of enforcing any provisions in the Constitution, such as the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause, which has in it an implicit guarantee of fair dealing among the people and between the people, and instead to say, if you want to do something that's really not for the judge, that is obviously pretextual, such as, but to benefit one group, such as Congress bans the sale of filled milk, that is milk which has made from coconut oil. And because the dairy lobby doesn't like the lower priced competition. And yeah, there's some like bogus findings, though it's supposedly dangerous to health. All nonsense. Filled milk is fine for just about everyone except for infants. In a case called Caroline Products, the court says, we don't care. We wash our hands of any judicial review of the whole thing. And so now we get this political system in which log rolling, special interest, not for the general welfare type legislation is considered the norm. And this has something the founders would have well understood. It is a vicious cycle of destroying the virtue of the public. It's the same kind of situation you had in the Weimar Republic, where people are not looking for the general good, the general welfare of the United States of America, but they're coming into government and saying, give me my share by taking from somebody else, whether it's taking tax money from somebody else, whether it's money borrowed from China, whether it's not money, we can't even borrow from China anymore, whether it's phony money, in essence, printed by the Federal Reserve that is so supposedly buying these treasury notes. That's like paying that is paying your Visa with your MasterCard. That all this becomes a normal part of the political culture, and that further accelerates the decline of the vicious cycle of the degeneration of the political culture. The progressives were right when they were concerned about the corruption in the previous political system. They were right to complain that the government was too often distant from the people and served the interests of big business rather than we the people. They were right, and they were right to be worried about a political culture in which selfish interests were given more weight than the national interest. Yet what the progressives accomplished through their assault on the Constitution was to make every one of these problems much worse. So much worse that our economy was nearly destroyed by the collapse of a speculative banking bubble, speculative housing bubble caused by the federal government under the Bush administration, and seriously worsened by the accurate perception that both political parties would use the public's money to save Wall Street from the consequences of its own irresponsible risks, thereby encouraging even more dangerous risk-taking in the future. And so much worse now that our national government is rapidly approaching insolvency. The Constitution created a federal government that was intended to do a few things well, and now we have a federal government that does very many things very poorly. And now, let's have a break.